In the last lecture, we were talking about really a couple of related things. One of which was, broadly speaking, Aristotle's methodology for studying political questions. And I had pointed out that for Aristotle, there is a dual kind of activity that goes on in the study of political phenomenon. This is what defines his version of what political science is. And that at one and the same time, political science is about describing different kinds of political phenomenon, explaining certain kinds of political phenomena. We'll get to that a little while. And also, it's about evaluating them at the same time, asking, are different systems, are different systems of government, different ways of organizing community, just or unjust? Do they, as we'll see, have a claim on serving the general interest rather than the common interest? And the second thing he was talking about, and this is right at the beginning of book 3, is in a related ways his discussion of citizenship. And he asked the question, who is the citizen? And he gives two answers, one of which reflects that empirical side I was talking about, and the other of which reflects the normative element that I was speaking of. So he says that a citizen is whoever is defined by a given constitution as having some sort of political rights. In other words, the Constitution says these people are citizens and these people aren't. And as you know, that is very much, say, with what happens in Athens, right? That citizens are defined by birth, and that some people, namely medics, these people coming from outside, cannot have a claim or do not have a claim on being a citizen pretty much ever. There's no mechanism, at least no formal mechanism, for what we would call naturalization. So that's one definition, right? It's just citizen is whoever a constitution says a citizen is. Pure and simple. And the other one is citizen in a normative sense. And the question here is who ought, see, there's your normative element, who ought to have citizenship, right? And Aristotle's view is that only people who have, as I've suggested, moral, who possess the virtues, have a good moral character, and also have the ability to govern, the prudence to govern. Those are the people who should be citizens in a normative sense. Those people who ought to be citizens, and that the consequence of this is Aristotle's definition of citizenship, properly speaking, ruling and being ruled in turn. In other words, the reciprocity of relationships between citizens who all possess essentially the same qualities. Well, this then gets us into another important part of Aristotle's contribution to political thought generally, and to this early political thought that we're studying. And that is that Aristotle, starting in book 3 and then all the way through book 4, analyzes, classifies different kinds of constitutional systems. And he does so based on, and this is significant, right? Based on empirical evidence, which is to say, Aristotle and his students, we know, collected and wrote perhaps hundreds of constitutional histories of various cities in the Greek, in Greece, various polis in Greece, right? And so that two things are done with this. What's going to happen in 5 and 6, but one, on Aristotle is then able to to synthesize these, right, and to give a description of the different kinds of constitutions that, in fact, existed at one time or another in various cities. Now, again, it may be because, remember, constitutions in this context, constitutions until well beyond our period are not written documents, right? They're practices, they're institutions. They change over time. Sometimes they change dramatically and radically. Sometimes they evolve, but they're not fixed. They're not written. So what Aristotle is doing then is not simply defining in a very sort of what do I want to say, abstract way, different forms of constitutions. He is, and you'll see this in 3 and 4, he does take into account variations within different kinds of constitutions, or variations within systems that have to do with perhaps who defines citizenship, what kinds of offices are held, and different kind of property qualification, and there are a whole bunch of things, right? So that you have this ideal typology that he posits, and then you have his recognition that there are variations on that typology. Nevertheless, the typology itself is important. Aristotle is arguably the first person, the first political theorist. Now, of course, you say first, and I've discovered over decades that the minute you say first, somebody's going to say, yeah, but what about blah, blah, blah. But he is perhaps, if not the first, then certainly the most influential political theorist of the ancient Western world, to create this classification in the system of classification in a formal way. We saw that Plato in the Republic acknowledges different kinds of constitutional systems, democracy, tyranny, and so forth. But there's no attempt to systematize them in any way. It's the case that in a later work by Plato called The Statesman, he does do a little bit of that, but it's not formal in the way that it is in Aristotle, which is typical. Right? Aristotle, it has the logical formalized system, and Plato is a little looser in that regard. But in any case, so Aristotle is really the first person to give us an account of how constitutions, different kinds of constitutions, are structured, and we can do this on a what do I need here? No, that's not. Sorry, folks. All right. Okay. We can do this in a basically I must say model. What am I looking at? What am I saying? Anyway, doesn't matter. How he engages in this classification, and again, perfect example of Aristotelian political science. Right? He says that there are two factors. This should have actually gone out here. Oh, good Lord! All right. There are two factors to take into consideration. The question of who is ruling. Who, and by ruling I mean here, who is exercising the political rights that are characteristic of the offices that are necessary for the polis to operate. And so by who's ruling. And he says that we can break this down into the one, the few, and the many. The one, the few, and the many. So that's our who. And then we can also differentiate constitutions according to or on an axis of evaluation of justice. And injustice. Which systems live up to the standard of justice, and which fail? Now, what do we mean by the standard of justice here? In general, Aristotle's theory of justice is a formal rather than a substantive one. It's a distributive theory rather than a substantive theory, is how we would put it. A substantive theory is essentially what Plato does in the Republic. Plato gives us posits a concept of justice, which, as we've seen, is primarily an intellective one, and then builds a polis around that concept of justice. Doing one's job and minding one's own business is his definition of justice. And so what you've got there is a situation in which the features of the polis are being crammed into, for want of a better phrase, are being created, right, accordance with this principle, this pre-existing principle of justice. Distributive justice, by contrast, simply means that you answer the question, right, of who exercises political rights on what grounds. What's the basis of it? And at the same time, who deserves it, right? So it's justice understood both as the question of evaluation of who ought to of the individuals who ought to be assigned the role of citizens or the power associated with political power, and then the question of how is that manifested, and these two things go together again in perfect Aristotelian sense. Now, justice in the end, how we evaluate justice in the end, how we evaluate that proper distribution of offices, of rights, and so forth, is essentially on the criteria of the common good. In other words, the just system, the just constitutional system, is one in which the common good is served. It's one in which everybody, every person in that society, has what they deserve. Right? There's a classic definition of justice. Right? Justice is having what you merit, having what you deserve, and when you have what you deserve in this distributive sense, then the distribution is just. If, and we're going to talk about this, by contrast, we have a situation in which people have political offices, powers, rights, and so forth that they don't deserve, then you have a system in which you have which is unjust and serves the good of some and not the good of all. That problem of that definition of how do we know what people deserve is one that we're going to see Aristotle taking up in books 5 and 6, broadly speaking. Right? So, justice is serving the common good, right? Injustice is then serving the private or partial good. good of some. Again, in the context of a constitutional system. So the constitutional system, broadly speaking, this ideal typology defines precisely how it is that these distinctions are manifest. Right. So we're talking about a theory of constitutions in terms of the different types of constitutions, and also whether those constitutions themselves are conducive to a public good, a general good, general welfare, or to the good of some. Now, in the case of the one, the just system is kingship. Now, notice, and this you're going to see this again when we get to later theorists. Right? Kingship is, by definition, a positive evaluation. We think of kingship perhaps as being as being sort of just any system of rule in which you have one person, you have one monarch, and it is that system doesn't matter whether the person is good or bad, doesn't matter whether the system itself is corrupt or not, that's still a king. So in other words, we have a purely descriptive concept of kingship. But Aristotle, when he uses the word king, uses it in a normative sense. And so is every political theorist down the line throughout the rest of antiquity and into early Europe. Kingship is, by definition, the good rule of one man, the good rule of one person. It's an inherently normative term. So when you see the word king, don't think of it in that modern sense. You've got to think of it in this traditional sense. A king is always a good ruler, and kingship is a system of rule by a single man who is good and who looks out for the common good, the common welfare. By contrast, of course, and again, normatively understood, is the tyrant. The tyrant is the rule of one person entirely for his own interests. The tyrant exists, and think back to what Plato says in the Republic, because that does capture. The tyrant exists purely driven by self-interest, and the tyrant's will is what will later be called arbitrary. Whatever he wants, he gets, or else. And of course, this means the tyrant is serving a private good, his own good, and by definition is unjust, because he's not interested in the good of anybody else. He's interested specifically in the good of himself and nobody else. Nobody else matters. So we got the rule of the one. Just, it's the king. Unjust, it's the tyrant. Now, when we use the word tyranny, of course, by contrast, we do think of it in a normative sense, right? I mean, tyrants are we would think, are always bad, right? They're always bad rulers. Tyrannical government is always a bad system of government. So there, you see, there's the normative part. Right? Tyranny is a word that in our vocabulary still conveys the same idea that it does here. It's a bad government by a single person. But kingship doesn't. Right? Kingship becomes a term that is emptied of moral content. But think of kingship. When you see the word kingship in Aristotle, and indeed in the whole, everybody going down to 15th century and Christine de Pizan, every time you see kingship, think good man, good system only. just system only. It's not a generic term. And that's one of those things that's you need to get across, because when we get, as I said, it's going to be the case when we get to Cicero. It's going to be the case when we get to John of Salisbury, and on down the line. So kingship always normatively good in this history of discourse. All right, well, what system of government do we have, of just government, when the few rule? And that is aristocracy, which literally means the rule of the best, the rule of the aristoi. Aristoi means the best. And here Aristotle's best is defined specifically by those people who have the moral education, who have the leisure. I mean, I put in my notes somewhere, leisure, 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 in part because it's a word you're going to see repeatedly in Aristotle's theory as being kind of just basic and central. When you get into his ideal government, you'll see it come up. So it's the case that these people have to have an education, moral and presumably intellectual. They have to have an education, and they have to have the leisure to be able to exercise their virtues with one another. So you can't, and this is there's so much dispute, but which I'll talk about. The problem is that it's not clear whether Aristotle thinks that this is ultimately the best government, and that what he's describing down the line is an ideal, as his ideal is aristocracy. It looks like it, but it's different people disagree about it. So, but aristocracy is the rule of the best people in exactly the sense I've discussed. Its contrary is oligarchy, which is the rule of the wealthy and the well-born. It's the rule of a nobility that is a blood nobility and that has a disproportionate control, virtually a monopoly on the goods, especially the property, the landed property, which is so important in a given polis. But the oligarchs say that, or take the position that they are simply born superior. And that's a position you can see over and over and over again. They are born superior, that by the nature of their bloodlines, and that therefore they deserve to have disproportionate power, which they then use in their own interests, to suppress and control the people who are not noble, who are not wealthy, to hold them in control. So these people confuse being the best, right, with being the wealthiest, people who've got the most social status, who can claim that noble bloodline, and claiming the noble bloodline, saying, look, by nature, I am, as a member of this ruling class, by nature, I am a superior human being. So this idea of superiority, natural superiority, and therefore justifying governing, but they're governing for their own interests, right? Private and partial interests. The oligarchs govern for themselves. They're not interested in the good of those who are not members of this natural nobility. Careless, right? The only thing that's important is vis-a-vis everybody else. Right? The only thing that's important is that they be kept under control, and to the extent possible, they be exploited. So oligarchy is a system in which one class, one group, pursues self-interest. It's interesting that Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, doesn't talk about in this. He gives this classification. Doesn't go into a lot of detail like he does in the Politics. But what's interesting is that in the Ethics, he doesn't talk about oligarchy. He talks about timocracy. He talks about, think about, back to Plato's Republic, the rule of those who crave honor and glory and so forth for themselves, not for the good of the city. That's why timocracy, which comes out of, is the first constitution in that degeneration of constitutions. That timocracy, in fact, is an evil constitution, right? It's an unjust constitution, but it's still the rule of at least people who have a claim, who think they have a claim, maybe through their military prowess, and even through their education, have a claim on being able to govern, right? Because they're honorable. So it basically is the same sort of thing that's going on. And here's what's really interesting, is you got in a work that is the same work, right? In other words, I talked about it, the Ethics and the Politics originally were a single book, and that they were re-edited to look like two books. All right. And so he seems to be within one book pointing to two different constitutions, right? The oligarchic and the timocratic, both of which have certain shared characteristics. That it's a rule of a certain group of people for their own interests, however those interests may be defined. But why would Aristotle do this? And this goes to something I didn't talk about, and that's really interesting. We think of Aristotle as being, and for good reason, very logical. There is his ideas cross over, right? So teleology was the perfect example, right? He's got a teleology built into his political theory. And the idea of teleology is also there in its conception of nature in the physics and in the metaphysics. And so they cross reference. And this happens quite a lot. So on the one side, it looks like much more systematic than, say, Plato does. I mean, logically systematic. And in fact, Aristotle wrote a number of books on logic, important books and influential books on logic. On the other hand, you've got two problems. Problem number one is, throughout the work of Aristotle, and even in singular works, there are contradictions. There are things. There are claims that are incompatible with one another. There are simply places where one of these things is not like the other, and that has always bothered scholars, and a lot of scholarship on Aristotle, in fact, constitutes an attempt to reconcile these different apparent contradictions with greater or lesser success. The other problem is you do have those cross references, right? You do have those cross references. You have it looking like Aristotle has the whole, right? The whole in front of him, and then is, as I said in the Metaphysics, right? Or as I said in De Anima, which is his work on the soul, or anything, and that there's back and forth in a way that is highly systematic, and there's this cross referencing. Now, the difficulty there is it would mean that Aristotle would have to have sat down, wrote all that he wrote, and then edited it with references to these different works, um, which for a number of reasons seems highly implausible. The way in which scholars have gotten around this problem, or these two problems, excuse me, is by positing that Aristotle did not write Aristotle's works. I know that sounds crazy, but rather that what we call Aristotle's writings, in fact, are essentially the basis based on lecture notes from courses that Aristotle gave in the Lyceum, and that are then edited together to create these various books. So they're Aristotle's ideas, but literally writing it down is not Aristotle. And there's been significant study about this in terms of who might have been responsible for it. And probably the best example is one of Aristotle's most influential Aristotelian from the next generation, Theophrastus. And that he was in essence, he and others were in essence responsible for putting together Aristotle's books. And that does a nice job of explaining both of the issues we have, right? Namely these contradictions. So you've got different descriptions of the rule of the few in an unjust way in what it was essentially the same book. And these contradictions, because quite possibly Aristotle thought one thing at one time and then changed his mind or developed his view in some way. And so that this just simply gets written down, and there's no concern about trying to reconcile these two things. And then, of course, the other thing is it explains all these cross references, right? You've got all of these works in front of you that have come out of student lecture notes, right, and have been reconstructed. And at that point, having that, you can then cross reference. You can then, as is said in the metaphysics, blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, that is one hypothesis. Now, I personally have always feared that idea. I mean, if I think that over the years, my lecturing, say, on Aristotle, students have taken notes and then tried to edit them together, that's a very scary idea. But of course, Aristotle, if this is true, wasn't around to see it anyway. But yeah, I wouldn't want, I definitely wouldn't want that for a whole bunch of reasons. And then being represented as my views. And there would be contradictions, right? Because there's development. So I just wanted to point this out in part because it does then open the question of sort of the structure of Aristotle's project more broadly, and I think it's worth acknowledging. It's a question I'm not sure will ever be resolved completely, but there's one sense in which it is entirely possible Aristotle didn't write Aristotle's works. Not that it isn't Aristotle's ideas, but that in the form it has been set down, it wasn't Aristotle, with the pen on the parchment, writing it all out. It still is. We still quite possibly, knowing this, still say Aristotle says, right? And I'm not going to change them. I'm not going to say some Aristotelian follower of Aristotle wrote this down every time. Aristotle says. We'll just leave it at that. But I mean, consider that as a possibility. All right. And again, we'll talk about some of these other potential contradictions. Right, so the rule of the many, Aristotle calls, in a just way, Aristotle calls politeia. Politeia. The word politeia is normally in Greece, or in Greek political thought, Greek political writing, is a term that is the generic word for constitution. In other words, there is in one sense, all of these, right, are forms of politeia. All of these are constitutional forms, just different distributions of power and so forth. But he uses it here very specific way. It is the politeia is the rule of the many for the good of all. Rule of the many for the good of all. And this has been again, an ongoing sort of question. Why exactly does he do this? And I'm not going to even begin to get into the kind of answers, or you'd be the lecture would go on forever, and it would put you to sleep, I think. But politeia is, in fact, when you cash it out, right, is a mixed constitution. It's a mixed constitution. In other words, it's a constitution under which there is power sharing between different groups. Now, I'm going to hold off on getting into detail about this because it's really very interesting, and it raises a question about Aristotle's stance towards it. Okay, and of course, the rule of the many in an unjust way is democracy. For him, it's basically democracy is in effect is mob rule. Democracy is the rule of the masses, the illiterate, stupid, incompetent, unvirtuous masses, but not just its rule, but its rule specifically against the wealthy. So, from the point of view of the oligarchy exists in order to feather its own nest at the expense of the masses. And in Aristotle's view, at the same time, it's the case that what I'm trying to say here. At the same time, it's the case that the democracy has the same characteristics in reverse. It's the rule of the masses. And this is, to keep in mind, this is what is generally thought during this period, right? Not that democracy is the system we think of, right? Where everybody, where everybody is not only counted equal, right? But in which the good is of the good defined by the people is the will of the people as a whole. Right? In other words, some sort of idea of popular sovereignty. Well, that's not what democracy is here. Democracy is class rule, the rule of the many over against the wealthy, and of course the big fear. And the big fear for democracy throughout its whole history. The big fear is that if you give those masses power, what are they going to do with it? They're going to redistribute the property, confiscate and redistribute the property of the nobility. You'll see this. You see this well beyond the period when we're going to study, well into the modern period. That democracy is inherently the class system, and the word democracy is not a word that one would associate with the rule of the people as a whole. It's very much the rule, the partial rule. So this is the system then that Aristotle, in terms of the classification of constitutions, this is the system that for Aristotle is a way of basically understanding how different constitutions behave. So the one, the few, and the many, right, is that quantitative question, descriptive question. The just and the unjust is the evaluative question. And for Aristotle, again, you can't separate them. For Aristotle, they all essentially must go together. Now, the other question to be raised is which system is, or are there systems which are more or less just? Again, this isn't just Aristotle. We're going to see this in arguments about this, right? In Aristotelian inflected political theory from the Middle Ages, from the 13th and 14th century, right? People are arguing what's the best system. Now, it's clear that for Aristotle, justice runs essentially in this direction. That is to say, the tyranny is the absolutely worst, most unjust system because it only serves one person. Oligarchy is unjust, but not as unjust as tyranny. And democracy is unjust, but ultimately it is for Aristotle at least, winds up being the least unjust system. It's still unjust, right? And there still is a bright dividing line between these two. But Aristotle seems to think that in terms of injustice, tyranny the most, oligarchy second, democracy third. Now, it flips and goes the other direction when we're talking about just systems. The Politeia, this mixed constitution that he describes, is minimally just, right? But it is just. But it is the least just in his view. But on the other hand, it is, and as I'll emphasize down a little while, Politeia is perhaps for him the best practicable constitution. Not the best constitution per se, but the most just one that you could possibly put into practice. Aristocracy then is more just than Politeia, and he thinks that kingship is the most just system. The rule of the king is, in absolute terms, the best system. Right? So we go from, this is evaluative, namely justice. And then we swing the other direction on Aristotle's other important concern, right, vis-a-vis constitutions, and that is stability. That is stability. Aristotle is looking for really two factors, asking two different questions. Is the Constitution just? And is the system stable? Right? Can it maintain itself? Can it be maintained for a long period of time? And stability, right, moves the other direction. So this moves this direction. Stability moves the other direction. He thinks kingship, while it is the most just constitution, is also the most unstable. And he says this, he takes this position precisely because it's the case that the king, he defines the king as someone who is superlatively virtuous, someone whose virtue is so obviously greater than everybody else's, that you would want him to be the person who made the decisions, who ruled. You'd want to be ruled by that person if you yourself were a just person, right? If you were the kind of person who has the training, and one reason is a practical one, I think. Remember now that in Aristotle's organization of systems of knowledge, theoria, contemplation, philosophy, is still the highest form of fulfillment. Well, if you can trust the king to always make the right decision, then you can spend your time contemplating. Right? The people of leisure and education, who otherwise have to take some kind of hand in ruling, could say, great, and then would not have to worry about engaging in praxis because they could engage in contemplation all the time, essentially. Now, the problem, however, and the stability issue here, the problem, however, is Aristotle says that of necessity, he believes, people will be jealous of the virtue of the king and will exile him, will kick him out, or will kill him. In other words, kingship, because it is the rule of this one best man, is not stable, is inherently, he thinks, unstable. So it's the best system, but it's the least stable system. And then we go to aristocracy. Similar sort of problem, namely that those who claim to be the best, the aristoi, are going to be resented by those who aren't. Right? That those who are citizens, and aristocracy, the only people who qualify for citizenship are the best sort. The best sort are those who exercise virtue, who possess and exercise virtue. But amongst the others, whether they're the masses or even members of the landed nobility, right, who don't cut it as aristoi, right, aren't the best sorts of people, aren't virtuous in the way Aristotle is concerned. Those people are going to be resented for their virtue, he thinks, and in the end, aristocracy winds up potentially teetering on the edge of falling apart. Politeia, he says, of the just constitutions, Politeia is the most stable of them. It is, again, I'm going to talk about this. It is minimally just, but it does fall into the category of being just. And again, Aristotle says, keep this in mind, because not everybody, but a lot of students come back and describe the Politeia as Aristotle's best constitution. It's his best practicable constitution. He thinks essentially the best chance we have of creating some kind of just constitution in reality. Practicable is the key word. Now, of the unjust constitutions, democracy, he thinks, is the most stable. And it's most stable simply because you have a larger number of people who are able to exercise their will and against a minority. So the majority is the majority control means that there's greater stability in democracy. At least that's the argument. Oligarchy, less so, because you have fewer people trying to govern more people, and that proves difficult. And of course, tyranny, completely unstable. And it's completely unstable because the tyrant, amongst other things, always has to find ways to impose his will, his desires on everybody else. And the everybody else's are not going to be, regardless of who they are not going to be thrilled with that. And the tyrant always has got the problem of, even if he's got people supporting him, you can never trust him. You can never trust those people who are supposed to be your protectors and your friends. the tyrant is always in danger of being removed from his position. And so it's the least stable. But now notice it's interesting, right, that you get the same structure here, but on two different measures, you get exactly the opposite conclusions. And that, it seems to me, tells us something about the sophistication of Aristotle's analysis. Well, in the next part of this lecture, I'm going to talk about this idea of the mixed constitution at some length, and then I'm going to talk about what's going on in books 5 and 6 and how that works and how it relates to some of these issues in terms of especially stability.